The Mistletoe Secret. Chapter 1. The Sprig of Mistletoe. Nora had not planned to stop at the shop at all. She had planned to get coffee. The harbor kiosk was still open for the season, though the woman who ran it had already warned her twice that she would close it down the week after the tree lighting, same as every year, and reopen sometime in April when the ice finally let go of the pilings. Nora paid for a paper cup of coffee that was mostly for the warmth of holding it, and walked along the edge of the water while she waited for it to cool enough to drink. The harbor had gone quiet, the way it always did this time of year. The working boats pulled and stacked for winter, only a handful of hulls still rocking against their moorings. Ice had crept in along the shallow edges overnight, thin enough that a gull landed on it without breaking through, then walked a few careful steps before deciding the whole plan was a bad idea. Somewhere behind her, the Carver twins were arguing about whether the wreath on the harbor master's door was store-bought or homemade, a debate that had apparently been going on since Tuesday and showed no sign of resolving itself before Christmas. "It is obviously store-bought," Nessie was saying. "Look at how even the pine cones are." "Homemade, people buy even pine cones now," Jessie said. "That is not proof of anything." Nora let them argue past her without joining in, the way she had learned to do years ago, and turned up Main Street with her coffee finally cool enough to drink. The town had gone all in on the season the way it did every December, lights strung from every lamppost, a wreath on nearly every door, the kind of effort that made Harrow Cove look, for about 6 weeks, like the town it liked to believe it was the rest of the year. She was not due at the station for another 40 minutes. The Mistletoe Shop sat 2 doors down from the harbor kiosk, its window display glowing even in daylight, and she told herself the stop was about the wreath she had seen there last week. Dried orange slices and cinnamon sticks tied with twine, though she had not moved toward buying it either time. The bell over the door gave one clean note when Nora pushed it open, and Clara Ashford looked up from behind the counter before the sound had finished. "You again," Clara said. "Twice in 1 week. I should start charging rent for the doorway." Nora let the door swing shut behind her. "I was driving past, that is all." "Nobody drives past this shop. They drive to it." The store smelled the way it always smelled in December, pine wax on the wooden shelves and peppermint from the bowl of candy canes Clara kept by the register for children who came in with their parents. Strings of small white lights ran along the top of every shelf, and a tree stood in the front window, heavier with ornaments than any tree Nora had seen outside a store display. She had come in the week before for something small, a card for her grandfather, and had left 20 minutes later, having bought nothing at all. Just talked. Clara came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, even though they were not dirty. "The tree lighting is in 2 weeks. You are still coming." "I come every year." "You come every year and stand at the back with your coffee and pretend you are working." "I am working. Community presence." Clara laughed, a short sound that filled the small space more than it should have. She had a way of talking that made the town sound like something she had built with her own hands, rather than moved into 10 years ago. She organized the tree lighting herself, ran the toy drive out of the back room every December, and kept a ledger of which families needed a little extra help that nobody outside the shop ever saw. "I need 3 more volunteers for hot cocoa duty," Clara said. "You know anyone foolish enough?" "I know Ed." "Your grandfather does not count. He already said yes before I asked." Nora smiled and drifted toward a shelf near the window, where rows of glass ornaments caught the light in a way that made the whole display look like it was breathing. Beside them sat a small basket of mistletoe sprigs, each one wrapped in plain craft paper and tied with a strip of red ribbon. "These are new," Nora said. "Every year I say I will not restock them, and every year I sell out by the 15th. Clara reached past her and lifted one from the basket. "People like the idea of it more than the plant itself." Nora picked one up, turned it over once. How much? For you, free. For everyone else, $6. I am paying. Clara did not argue, only rang it up with the same efficiency she brought to everything in the shop and slid the small paper bag across the counter. Nora reached for it, and that was when Clara picked up a second sprig from the basket, holding it near the window light as if she were seeing it for the first time. Mistletoe is supposed to bring love and peace, Clara said. But did you know it is poisonous? The berries can kill a child. Nora looked at her. That seems like bad marketing. Beautiful things are often dangerous. Clara set the sprig back down, careful, the way someone sets down something they have decided not to sell. Nobody reads the label until it matters. It was the kind of thing Clara said sometimes, a little too polished to be spontaneous, the sort of line she might have used before at the register to close a sale or start a conversation with a bored teenager waiting for a parent. Nora did not think much of it. She filed it away out of habit rather than suspicion, the same way she filed most things, and reached for her paper bag. You are going to hang that somewhere embarrassing, Clara said. I am going to hang it somewhere nobody will notice. That is the worst possible use of mistletoe. Through the front window, past the display of ornaments and the reflection of the tree, a man in a work jacket stood on a ladder across the street, adjusting a string of lights wound around a lamppost. He worked without looking at the shop, his back mostly turned, one hand steadying the ladder while the other pulled a section of cord taut. Nora noticed him the way she noticed most things in town, without deciding to, and then stopped noticing him at all. Is that for the square? She asked, nodding toward the window. Clara glanced over. The whole street gets redone every year before the lighting. Different company than last year, I think. I do not keep track. You keep track of everything. I keep track of things that matter to me. Clara said it lightly, but there was something underneath it, a flatness that did not match the rest of the conversation. It passed as quickly as it came. Go on, you will be late. Nora checked the clock above the register, more out of habit than need, and picked up her bag. I will see you at the lighting. You will see me before that. I still need those volunteers. Ask Ed again. He likes being asked twice. Everybody likes being asked twice, Clara said. It is the third time that gets suspicious. Nora laughed and pushed the door open, the bell giving its single clean note again as she stepped out into the cold. The street was busier than it had been 20 minutes earlier. A few cars easing along Main Street, a woman walking a dog wearing a small red sweater. The man across the street still working his way down the string of lights, unhurried, methodical, the kind of work that looked like it had been done 100 times before. Two boys were dragging a sled up the small rise beside the church, arguing over whose turn it was to steer, and Reverend Miller stood on the front steps with a box of paper stars destined for the windows, watching them with the patient amusement of a man who had seen the same argument every winter for 30 years. Down at the corner, someone had propped a ladder against the hardware store to string a fresh line of lights along the awning, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from a chimney somewhere behind the shops, thin and sweet against the cold. Nora got into her car and set the paper bag on the passenger seat. Her radio crackled once, a routine check-in from dispatch. Nothing that needed a response beyond the automatic click of acknowledgement. She pulled away from the curb, past the harbor where the Carver twins were still arguing, past the frozen edge of the water catching the pale morning light, and in her rearview mirror, the shop window slid past, warm and lit, the tree glowing behind the glass, Clara's shape moving somewhere near the register. Nora did not know it was the last time she would see her that way. Chapter 2. What the Snow Covered. The station was quiet when Nora came in, the way it always was in the hour before a shift change. a pot of coffee going stale on the back counter, and someone's radio playing low enough that the words dissolved into static before they reached the front desk. Cole was already at his desk, reading glasses pushed up into his hair, a stack of holiday patrol schedules in front of him that he had clearly been staring at longer than he needed to. "You are early," he said, not looking up. "I am on time." "You are early for you." He tapped the schedule. "Extra coverage downtown through the lighting. Everybody wants 2 officers on Main Street after 5, in case somebody's cousin from Portland gets ambitious with the collection box outside the church." Has that ever actually happened? Once, 1991, before your time. Cole finally looked up. "You will be walking the square most evenings this month. Try to look like you are enjoying it." Nora poured herself coffee she did not particularly want, mostly for something to do with her hands, while Cole went through the rest of the schedule out loud, half to her and half to himself. He complained, without much heat, about the overtime budget, about the mayor's office wanting extra patrols paid for out of a fund that had already been spent twice on the new banners for Main Street, about how every December the same 3 people called to report the same missing inflatable reindeer from the same front lawn, only for it to turn up in a neighbor's shed a week later. Outside, a plow scraped along Harbor Road, the sound rising and fading as it passed the station windows. And somewhere down the hall, a printer clicked through a job nobody had come to collect yet. A dispatcher 2 desks over was arguing cheerfully with someone on the phone about whether the department's holiday party would have a real tree or the artificial one from the supply closet, a debate that had apparently carried over from the day before. It was the kind of morning that asked nothing of anyone, and Nora had almost let herself settle into it when the radio on Cole's belt cracked to life. Dispatch, calm and clipped. A welfare check requested at the Mistletoe Shop on Main Street. The shop had not opened on time. A regular customer, unable to raise anyone inside, had called it in. Cole was already standing. "You were closest. Go." Nora set her coffee down without drinking it and was out the door before she had fully registered why her chest had gone tight. The drive took 4 minutes, though it felt shorter. Main Street was busier than it had been an hour earlier, a few cars idling near the bakery, a woman on the corner walking a dog, wearing a small red sweater. Everything exactly as ordinary as it had been when Nora left it. She parked at an angle in front of the shop, the way she had been trained not to, and got out. The door was unlocked. The lights were on. She should have felt relief at that. She did not. Nora pushed the door open. The bell gave its single clean note, the same note it always gave, and the sound felt wrong in a way she could not name yet. The front of the shop looked the way it always looked: ornaments on shelves, tree in the window, candy canes in the bowl by the register. Then she saw the broken display case near the back, glass scattered in a wide arc across the floor, catching the light from the strings overhead in small, hard points. Clara was on the floor beside it. She was face down. Her head was turned slightly to the side, resting in a dark pool that had gone from wet to tacky at the edges. A heavy glass paperweight lay a few feet from her outstretched hand, also dark along one curved edge. Nora did not move for 3 full seconds. Then training took over, and she was on the radio, voice flat and fast, calling it in, clearing the store, checking for anyone else present, finding no one. She did not touch anything. She stood near the door and waited, her back to the cold outside, her eyes on the shape on the floor that had been talking to her about mistletoe 11 days ago. She thought, briefly and uselessly, about the paper bag still sitting on the passenger seat of her own car outside, the sprig she had bought here, and made herself stop thinking about it before the thought could go anywhere further. Cole arrived 9 minutes later, and after him, the county medical examiner, and after that, the slow machinery of a scene that had to be documented before it could be understood. Someone strung tape across the front door. Someone photographed the broken case from 4 different angles. The customer who had called it in, an older man Nora recognized from the harbor kiosk line, sat wrapped in a blanket in the back of a patrol car, giving a statement in a voice that kept catching on the same sentence. That he had only wanted a wreath. That the door was open. That he had called her name twice before he saw her feet. Outside, a small crowd had already gathered on the sidewalk, the way a crowd always gathered in Harrow Cove within minutes of anything unusual, drawn by parked cruisers and a sense that something worth knowing was happening. A man from the hardware store 2 doors down stood with his arms crossed against the cold, saying nothing, watching the tape flutter in the wind. The owner of the bakery across the street stood in her own doorway with a dish towel still in her hand, not crossing over, just watching. The way people watch things they already suspect they will be asked about later. Cole kept Nora out of the immediate scene once the ME arrived, which was standard, and set her instead on the display area near the front, cataloging what was where before anything got moved or bagged. It was tedious work, meant to keep a junior officer useful without letting her contaminate anything that mattered. And Nora understood that, even as she resented it a little. She worked her way down the shelf nearest the door, cross-checking each item against the laminated inventory sheet taped inside the register drawer, a habit of Clara's that suddenly felt less like tidiness and more like a gift she had left behind without meaning to. Ornaments. Counted. Candles. Counted. Boxed cards. Counted twice because the first count came out wrong and she did not trust her own hands yet. A row of glass paperweights, meant to sit in a neat line of 6, evenly spaced. The way Clara arranged everything in that shop, 5. Nora counted again. 5 paperweights. 1 gap in the line wide enough for exactly 1 more. The dust on the shelf beneath it disturbed in a way that did not match the rest of the shelf, as though something had been lifted straight up rather than slid aside. She looked back toward the broken case, toward the shape lying beyond it, toward the heavy glass sphere with its frozen sprig of mistletoe that the ME's assistant was photographing before bagging it as evidence. She checked the inventory sheet once more, running her finger down the column. Best seller, it read, in Clara's own handwriting, restock weekly. Someone had picked it up on the way in, not on the way to a display, on the way to Clara. Nora did not say anything yet. She wrote it down, the count, the gap, the disturbed dust, and set the notepad aside for Cole, the way she had learned to do with anything that felt important before she was sure it was. She noted the absence of Clara's phone, not on the counter, not near the register, not on her person. The ME's assistant confirmed it had not been found on the body. Nora filed that away too, alongside the missing paperweight, a separate detail that might mean something or might mean nothing at all. Cole found her there 20 minutes later when the worst of the scene work had settled into the slower rhythm of measurements and evidence bags. He looked tired already, though the day had barely started, and he looked at her notepad for a long moment before he looked at her. "You know this town," he said, "better than most of the department, and you notice things most people would walk past. The mayor's office already called twice asking how fast this gets solved before the lighting. I want you on this, actively, not filing paperwork behind me." "I can do that." "I know you can. That is the problem half the time." He almost smiled, the way he did when he meant something kinder than his voice let on. "Go home tonight. Start fresh tomorrow. There is nothing more here for either of us today that will not still be here in the morning." Nora nodded and stepped back out onto the sidewalk, where the crowd had thinned but not disappeared, where the cold had sharpened with the fall of early afternoon light. A few people had drifted off toward the harbor. Once word spread, there was nothing more to see. But others lingered near the tape, trading versions of the same 3 facts back and forth until the facts had grown into something none of them had actually witnessed. Across the street, the bakery owner had finally gone back inside, though the dish towel still hung forgotten over her shoulder as she moved past her own window. Nora looked back once before getting into her car. Through the shop's front glass, past the tape and the measuring markers and the last of the scene technicians, the Christmas tree in the window was still lit, ornaments catching the light the way they had that morning, glowing steadily over a room that no longer had any reason to look so warm. She drove home the long way, past the harbor instead of straight through town, though she could not have said why. The tide was out, and the mudflats beyond the frozen edge lay exposed and dull under the early dusk, gulls picking through them without hurry. A string of lights someone had hung along the harbor master's fence blinked on as she passed, timed to the fading light rather than the hour. And for a moment, the ordinariness of it, a fence, a timer, a string of bulbs somebody had bought at the hardware store, felt like the strangest thing she had seen all day. At home. She did not go inside right away. She sat in the driveway with the engine off, the paper bag from 11 days earlier still on the passenger seat, the sprig of mistletoe inside it wrapped exactly as Clara had wrapped it. And she did not open it. Chapter 3. The Register and the Ledger. By the time Nora reached the station the next afternoon, the shop had already been released back to the family, the tape gone from the door, a single officer posted out front only until the locksmith finished changing the lock. Cole had spent the morning on calls Nora was not part of, coordinating with the county on the autopsy timeline, fielding a second call from the mayor's office about the tree lighting, and by the time he found her at her desk, he looked like a man who had already used up most of his patience before noon. "Sarah Cross is at the shop now," he said, packing up her things. "Family gave her until end of week to clear out the back office. Go talk to her before she has time to get her story too smooth." "You think she needs a story?" "I think everybody who worked closely with a victim needs one, whether they did anything or not. Go find out which kind she has." Cole rubbed at his eyes before he said anything else, the gesture of a man who had been on the phone since 7 that morning. "The county confirmed cause of death. Blunt trauma to the temple. Single strike, front on. Whoever did it, she was looking right at them when it happened." Nora let that sit for a second. So she knew them, or trusted them enough to let them get close before she thought to be afraid. Cole slid a folder across the desk. The preliminary report, thin. Most of the boxes still blank, pending toxicology and the rest of the lab work. "Go talk to Sarah. I will be here catching up on every phone call I have avoided since Tuesday." The shop looked strange in daylight without customers. The front dark, the register drawer taped shut with an evidence seal, though the back office light was on, spilling a thin yellow line under the door that separated it from the sales floor. Nora let herself in through the rear entrance, the one employees used, and found Sarah kneeling beside a half-packed box, sorting through a drawer of pens and rubber bands like the task required more concentration than it did. The office smelled nothing like the shop out front. No pine wax, no peppermint, just the faint chemical bite of correction fluid drying on a stack of order forms. And beneath it, the low mechanical hum of a space heater running too hard for the small room, its coils ticking every few seconds as they cooled and reheated. Sarah looked up, and her hands went still on the drawer before the rest of her caught up. "I heard you were coming," she said. Cole called ahead. "I appreciate that, I think. Gave me time to stop crying before somebody official showed up." Nora took the chair across from the desk, The same chair, she guessed, that vendors and part-timers had sat in for years to be interviewed for jobs Clara had probably decided to give them within the first 5 minutes. "How long did you work here?" 5 years in March. Sarah's hand found the handle of her coffee mug. Wrapped around it, though the coffee inside had gone cold enough that no steam rose from it anymore. "She hired me the week I moved back from Bangor. I did not even have real retail experience. She just liked how I talked about the ornaments." "You were close." "I thought so." Sarah's jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked like she might stop there. The way people sometimes did when a question landed closer to something they had not planned on saying yet. Nora waited. She had learned, mostly from watching Cole, that silence did more work in these conversations than most questions did. "I took money," Sarah said finally. "Small amounts, never more than $40 at a time, out of the register, over the last few months. I told myself I would pay it back before year-end, and I never did, because there was always something else that needed it more that week." Clara found out. 2 days ago, she went through the register logs herself, which she almost never does. She trusts the software for that, but something made her check by hand this time. Sarah set the mug down without drinking from it. She did not yell. That was the worst part. She just told me what she had found and asked how much, and I told her. And she said she would not call the police if I paid it all back and resigned by the new year. You agreed. I agreed because I did not have another option that did not end with me in a courtroom. Sarah's voice thinned but did not break. I was here that afternoon. I left around 6. I went home and started packing, because what else was I going to do? Wait around for the humiliation to catch up with me in person every day until January? Anyone see you at home? No, I live alone. I did not call anyone. I did not go anywhere. I just packed boxes and cried in my kitchen like an idiot until I fell asleep on the couch. She looked at Nora directly for the first time since the question had started. I know how that sounds. I know I have no way to prove any of it. But I did not go back to this shop that night. I could not have looked at her again so soon after that conversation, guilty or not. Nora wrote it down without comment. The timeline. The confession about the theft. The absence of anyone who could confirm where Sarah had actually been. It was thin, the kind of alibi that came apart the moment someone pushed on it. But it was also, Nora thought, exactly the kind of thin that told the truth more often than it lied. Guilty people usually built something sturdier. The toy drive boxes are still in the corner, Sarah said, unprompted, nodding toward a stack of bins along the back wall, each one labeled in Clara's handwriting. Ages 6 to 8, ages 9 to 11, still half filled with donated toys nobody had finished sorting. I do not know what happens to those now. Nora looked at the boxes and did not have an answer for her. She left Sarah to her packing and stepped out through the front of the shop rather than the back, mostly because the front door was unlocked and closer, and found herself standing on the sidewalk in the flat gray light of early afternoon. Across the street, a crew was working the lampposts, restringing a section of lights that had apparently gone dark overnight, one string blinking weakly at half power, while a man on a ladder traced the wire back toward the junction box. A second man stood at the base of the ladder, steadying it, a clipboard tucked under one arm, calling up instructions that the man on the ladder mostly ignored in favor of his own method. He wore a jacket with Rose Lighting stitched in faded letters across the back, the kind of logo that had clearly been ironed on years ago and washed soft since. Afternoon, Nora said, mostly out of habit, the way she greeted most people she passed on Main Street. The man with the clipboard glanced over. Officer, everything holding up out here? Heard we had a bad string last night. Happens every year around this time. Cold snaps get into the wiring. Something shorts. We fix it before anybody notices it was ever out. He said it easily, the practiced answer of a man who had given the same explanation 100 times to 100 different people who did not particularly care about the answer. Thomas Rowe. My company's had the town contract 8 years running. Nora Callahan. I know. Everybody knows. After this morning. He said it without malice, just fact. The way anything got said in a town this size within a day of happening. Terrible thing. Clara always made sure we had cocoa waiting when we worked late on the square. Small thing, but you remember it. Nora nodded, glancing up at the tree beyond him, its lights running the full height in tight, even spirals, more elaborate than anything she remembered from previous years. Tree looks good this season. Thomas followed her gaze up toward it, and for just a moment something in his face closed. Not fear, exactly. Closer to the flinch of a man glancing at something he would rather not be reminded of. He looked away from the tree, fast, back down to his clipboard, flipping a page that did not need flipping. We do our best, he said, and the sentence came out flatter than the one before it. Anyway, I should let the crew finish before the light goes. Of course. Thanks for your time. He gave her a short nod and turned back toward the ladder. Calling up a correction to the man working the wire, his voice steady again, easy again. The moment already folded back into the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon. Nora walked back to her car, glancing once more at the string of lights winding up the trunk of the tree, at the crew working with the steady competence of people who had done this job every December for years. She got in, pulled out her notepad, and under Sarah's name wrote alibi, thin, motive, resolved. Then flipped to a fresh line and wrote, almost as an afterthought, Thomas Rowe, Rose Lighting, 8 years contract. Did not like looking at the tree. She underlined nothing. It was not enough yet to underline. She sat with the notepad open on her knee a moment longer than the note required, then closed it, started the car, and pulled away from the curb, the crew's ladder shrinking in her rear-view mirror against a sky already beginning to dim toward evening. Main Street had already started its slow shift into evening, storefronts switching from daylight to their strings of bulbs one by one, the hardware store's window display flickering to life as she passed, then the pharmacy, then the little stationery shop that only opened seasonally. A school bus idled near the corner, letting off 2 kids in matching mittens who ran the rest of the way home without waiting for their mother to catch up. None of it had anything to do with the case, and Nora found herself grateful for that, for a town that kept moving through its ordinary hours, even with one shop dark and taped and waiting for a locksmith. Chapter 4. Gingerbread and Wreaths. The Graves house smelled like cinnamon before Nora even got the front door open. A warmth that reached the porch through the gap under the frame and settled over her the moment she stepped inside, coat still half-buttoned, cheeks still cold from the drive. Ed was fighting with a wreath. He stood at the front door with his back to her. A length of dried orange slices and cinnamon sticks looped in twine held up against the wood, one hand pinning it in place while the other worked a nail that kept slipping sideways instead of going in straight. Biscuit sat a few feet away, watching the whole operation with the mild disinterest of a dog who had seen his owner lose this particular battle every December for as long as he could remember. A red bow tie clipped slightly crooked around his neck. You are doing that wrong, Nora said, shutting the door behind her. I am doing this exactly the way I did it last year. You said the same thing last year, right before it fell down, twice. Ed lowered the wreath and gave her a look that was mostly patience, with a thin seam of exasperation underneath it. If you have opinions, you are welcome to hold the nail. She took over without further discussion, steadying the wreath while Ed drove the nail properly this time, the two of them working in the kind of easy coordination that came from having done small tasks like this together for most of her life. When it finally held, straight and centered, Ed stepped back to inspect it with the seriousness of a man reviewing a much larger project. "Acceptable," he said. "High praise." "From me, yes." Biscuit trotted ahead of them into the kitchen, where the oven timer was counting down the last few minutes on a tray of gingerbread, the smell thick enough now to fill the whole downstairs. Cinnamon and clove, and something faintly citrus underneath it that Nora could never quite place and had stopped trying to years ago. The kitchen looked the way it always looked this time of year, cluttered in a comfortable rather than chaotic way. A stack of unopened Christmas cards on the counter, a half-finished cup of tea gone cold beside the stove. Ed's reading glasses sitting on top of a folded newspaper he had clearly abandoned for the wreath. "Sit," Ed said. "You look like you have been standing since morning." "I have been standing since morning." She sat anyway, at the same chair she had claimed at this table since she was 7 years old, and let herself exist for a few minutes without doing anything useful. The oven timer chimed, and Ed pulled the tray out with a towel, setting it on the stove top to cool. The gingerbread men slightly uneven, one with an arm that had spread too wide during baking and now looked like it was waving. "Walk the whole loop this morning," Ed said, mostly to fill the space while the tray cooled. "Ice on the lower path already. I nearly went down near the Hendersons' fence." "You did not tell me that." "I am telling you now. I did not fall. There is no story here worth worrying about." He set the towel aside and checked the tray with the back of one finger, deciding it was not ready yet. "The garden is finished for the year. I pulled the last of the kale before the frost got serious about it." "You hate kale." "I hate wasting things more than I hate kale." He said it with a particular flatness that meant he considered the matter closed, and moved on to setting out 2 plates neither of them strictly needed. "That one is having a better day than I am," Nora said. "Most things are, this week." Ed set 2 cups down, poured tea into both without asking if she wanted any, because he already knew. "You found her." It was not a question, and Nora did not treat it like one. "I did." "How are you?" "I do not know yet." She wrapped both hands around the cup, more for the warmth than the tea itself. "I keep doing the parts of the job I know how to do. That helps until it does not." Ed did not push further on that, which was its own kind of answer, and instead sat across from her with his own cup, waiting the way he always waited, patient enough that Nora eventually filled the silence herself, the way she usually did. She told him about it in pieces, not in order, the way it had actually come to her over the last 2 days, rather than the way it would read in a report. The paperweight missing from its place on the shelf, Sarah Cross crying over a drawer of pens, admitting to months of small theft and an arrangement that had ended the day before the murder. The lighting contractor outside the shop, pleasant enough, who had looked away from the tree so fast it seemed almost involuntary, though she could not yet say what that meant, if it meant anything at all. Ed listened without interrupting, breaking a gingerbread man in half and offering her the piece with the head, keeping the legs for himself. "What did Cole say about the paperweight?" he asked. "That it fits. Weight. Shape. The way the wound sits. He is waiting on the lab to confirm what we already know." "And the girl who was stealing?" "Sarah. Cole thinks her alibi is too thin to trust and too thin to disprove. Same thing I think. Honestly." Nora turned her cup a slow half-circle on the table, not drinking from it. "It is strange, sitting across from someone who clearly did something wrong and still believing they did not do the thing you are actually there to ask about. That happens more than people expect it to." Ed reached for another gingerbread man, considered it, set it back down instead of eating it. Guilt over one thing does not make someone guilty of everything else. People carry more than one secret at a time. and most of them are not even connected. You said cocoa, he said eventually. The contractor mentioned cocoa. Clara used to have it ready for the crews when they worked late on the square. So she knew him, not as a suspect, as a neighbor. Ed turned his teacup a quarter turn on the table, the way he did when he was thinking something through before he said it out loud. Who in this town knows more about what everyone else is doing behind their own front doors than the person who runs the shop where they all buy their decorations? Clara did. And who would that make nervous this time of year if she started looking too closely at something she was not supposed to see? Nora turned that over, not quite following where he meant to take it, and did not answer right away. Biscuit shifted from his spot near the stove to lie down against Ed's feet instead, a slow, leisurely migration that took the better part of a minute. Ed reached for the teapot, refilled his own cup first, then hers, unhurried about it the way he was unhurried about most things. A man who sells poison does not call it poison, he said. He calls it something else. The question is not what he calls it. The question is, who finally reads the label? He said it the way he said most things, evenly, without adding weight to the words themselves. Then he set the teapot down and reached for another gingerbread man. He broke off the head and offered the rest to Biscuit, who accepted it with the solemn gratitude of a dog who considered himself owed. Nora did not ask him to explain. She had learned a long time ago that asking rarely got her anything more than a longer silence, and that whatever Ed meant by a thing usually arrived on its own schedule, sometimes days later, sometimes not until she was standing in the middle of something and the words simply surfaced. Already understood. She filed it away instead, the way she filed most things Ed said, and let the conversation drift somewhere else entirely, toward the wreath and whether it would survive the week, toward whether Biscuit's bow tie was actually crooked or whether it had always been crooked and she had simply never noticed before tonight. Later, as she stood to leave, Ed mentioned almost offhand that the town had quietly postponed the tree lighting. Bad weather forecast, he said, though they both knew it had nothing to do with weather. The kitchen stayed warm around them, the last of the gingerbread cooling on the tray. The window above the sink gone fully dark now, except for the porch light catching the edge of the wreath they had finally hung straight. Ed asked nothing more about the case for the rest of the evening, and Nora did not offer anything more either, content for a while to sit at the table with tea gone lukewarm in her hands and a dog asleep against her grandfather's feet, the whole house holding still around the two of them the way it always had. Nora finally stood when the tea had gone properly cold a second time, gathering her coat from the back of the chair while Ed wrapped 4 of the gingerbread men in a paper napkin and pushed them across the counter toward her without comment, the way he always sent her home with something even when she had not asked for it. Biscuit lifted his head at the sound of her zipper, decided the movement did not concern him, and let it drop again against Ed's slipper. At the door, Ed reached past her to flick on the porch light before she stepped out, an old habit from years of walking her brother and then her to the car after dark, back when the driveway had felt longer than it actually was. He did not say anything about the case again, and she did not offer anything more either, both of them settling into the kind of quiet that only worked between two people who had spent enough years not needing to fill every silence with words. By the time she left, the porch light was the only thing still on, and the wreath held its shape against the door without needing anyone to steady it. Chapter 5. Ornaments and Old Wounds. The Harborview Inn sat 2 blocks off Main Street, the kind of place that filled up every summer with tourists chasing lobster rolls and emptied out again by October, leaving only a handful of rooms occupied through the winter, mostly relatives visiting for the holidays who did not want to stay under the same roof as the family they had come to see. A cardboard cutout of Santa leaned against the front desk, slightly deflated, and the woman behind the counter directed Nora upstairs without needing to check a registry. The way small hotels in small towns always seemed to know exactly who was where. The lobby kept itself too warm, the kind of heat that came from a radiator running harder than the season required. And by the time Nora reached the second floor, she had already unzipped her coat halfway. Room 14 sat at the end of the hall, and the woman who opened the door before Nora had finished knocking looked like she had been standing behind it, waiting, for longer than made sense for someone with nothing to hide. "You are the officer," Eleanor Ashford said, not quite a question. "Nora Callahan. I have a few questions if you have a moment." "I have nothing but moments. I am not permitted to leave until someone tells me I can." Eleanor stepped back to let her in, the gesture precise, economical, a woman who did nothing without deciding to do it first. The room smelled faintly of perfume that had been reapplied too many times over too many hours. Something floral and expensive gone slightly stale, layered over the dry heat pumping steadily from the radiator under the window. A single suitcase sat open on the luggage rack, contents folded with a neatness that seemed less like habit and more like a way of keeping her hands occupied. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed rather than the room's one chair, leaving the chair for Nora, a small courtesy delivered without warmth. "I assume you want to know where I was. That would help." "Here, all night. I did not leave this room after 6 o'clock, and no one can confirm that for you, because I did not call anyone, and no one called me." She said it flatly, the practiced delivery of someone who had already anticipated the question and resented having to answer it a second time. "I am aware of how that sounds." "You saw Clara that evening?" "I saw my daughter for exactly 40 minutes, and I have regretted every one of them since, though not for the reason you were hoping to hear." Eleanor's hands folded in her lap, still, deliberate. "We argued. It was not the first time. It will not surprise you to learn we were never a family that argued quietly." "What was the argument about?" Eleanor did not answer immediately. She looked toward the window instead, where the harbor was visible in a thin gray strip beyond the glass. And when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier precision. 10 years ago, Clara's father wanted to leave her the majority of the estate. I told him she had already taken enough from this family by leaving it, moving to a fishing town to sell trinkets in a shop with a ridiculous name, embarrassing everyone who still had to explain her absence at gatherings. I convinced him to change the will. She received nothing. Not because he wanted it that way, because I did. Nora kept her expression steady, though the admission landed harder than she had expected. "You came here to tell her that?" "I came here because I am 70 years old, and I have started noticing how few years I likely have left to fix the things I am ashamed of, and this was the largest one." Eleanor pressed her lips into a thin line, a gesture Nora recognized from Sarah 2 days earlier, though on Eleanor it looked more like discipline than fear. "She did not forgive me. I did not expect her to. We shouted at each other in that shop until I could not stand to be looked at any longer, and I left. And I came back here. And I sat exactly where you are sitting now and cried until I fell asleep with my shoes still on." "And you did not go back?" "I did not go back." Eleanor met her eyes directly. "I wanted to. I told myself I would try again in the morning, once we had both slept, once the worst of it had worn off enough to say something useful to each other. I never got the chance." Nora let the silence sit for a moment before closing her notepad. There was nothing left to write that Eleanor had not already said plainly, without softening any of it for her own benefit. Which was, Nora thought, either the mark of someone with nothing left to protect, or someone confident enough in her own alibi to say the ugliest version of the truth first. "Thank you for your time," Nora said, standing. "You are welcome to it. I have very little else to do with it now." Eleanor did not rise to see her out, only turned back toward the window, toward the gray strip of harbor. Her hands still folded in her lap the way they had been since Nora walked in. Nora paused at the door. "Will you stay in town for the arrangements?" "Someone has to. I doubt anyone else will volunteer." Eleanor did not turn from the window. "I raised her badly, and then criticized her for the results. I would like the chance to do one thing properly, even if it is only choosing which flowers she would have hated least." Nora let herself out without another word, closing the door quietly behind her, and made her way back down the overheated stairwell, past the deflated Santa still leaning against the front desk, out into air that felt sharper and cleaner for having just left that room. By the time Nora reached the Graves house that evening, full dark had settled over the driveway, and a fresh tree leaned against the porch rail where Ed had left it that afternoon, its branches still bound in netting. The smell of cut balsam thick enough to reach the car before she had even shut the door. "You bought a bigger one than last year," she said, eyeing it as she climbed the steps. "I bought the same size as last year. You are simply comparing it to the memory of the tree after we had already trimmed it down twice." They wrestled it inside together, Ed directing more than lifting, Biscuit supervising from a safe distance near the stairs. And once it stood upright in its stand by the front window, needles shedding faintly onto the rug beneath it. Ed stepped back to squint at it from 3 different angles before declaring it straight enough. A judgment he revised twice more before finally leaving it alone. The lights came out of the closet under the stairs in the same tangled mass they went into it as every January, and untangling them took longer than actually stringing them around the tree. Ed muttering about buying new ones every year and never following through. Nora working one knot loose only to find 2 more waiting beneath it. By the time the strand finally lit clean, Biscuit had abandoned his post near the stairs in favor of a spot directly under the lowest branches, where he stayed for the rest of the evening, undisturbed by the occasional falling needle. Once the lights were strung, the 2 of them worked through the ritual of unpacking the ornament boxes that had not seen daylight since last January. The boxes still held the same order they always held. Tissue paper gone soft with age, wrapped around ornaments that traced back further than Nora's own memory of them. A glass bird that had belonged to her grandmother. A crooked felt star Jamie had made in 2nd grade that nobody had ever had the heart to replace with something straighter. Ed hung the star first, the way he did every year, without comment. The same corner of the tree, the same slight tilt to the left. Nora worked her way through a string of smaller ornaments, glass and tin, and 1 carved wooden reindeer missing half an antler, hanging each one in the gaps Ed left for her. The 2 of them moving around each other in the small space without needing to discuss where anything went. Her phone buzzed against the side table where she had left it. She wiped her hands on her jeans before picking it up. Snow in Bangor. Roads bad. Might be delayed, but coming. She read it twice, thumb hovering over the screen, and typed back without much deliberation. "Drive safe. Always." She set the phone back down, screen dark again, and reached for the next ornament in the box. A small glass sphere painted to look like a snowball. One she was fairly certain had come from the Mistletoe Shop years before Clara had ever owned it. Ed did not ask who the text was from. He did not need to. "Left side is getting heavy," he said instead, nodding toward the tree. "Balance it out." Nora moved to the right side and hung the ornament there, the glass catching the string lights they had already turned on, throwing a small, warm circle of color against the window glass and the dark beyond it. Ed reached into the box for the last few pieces. A strand of tinsel he insisted on adding, despite Nora's yearly objection that it always ended up scattered across the whole downstairs by February, and draped it over the upper branches with the same care he gave to everything else in that house. For a moment, standing there, with balsam still sharp in the air and the tree half finished in front of her, the shop and the paperweight and the woman crying alone in a hotel room felt very far away. The way certain evenings managed to hold themselves apart from everything surrounding them, at least for as long as the lights stayed on and nobody said anything to break it. Chapter 6. The Melted Wire. Cole had asked her to do a full sweep of the block around the shop. Nothing urgent, just a second pass to make sure nothing near the scene had been missed in the first 2 days of chaos. Nora took the assignment gladly. It gave her somewhere to walk that was not a hotel hallway or a back office smelling of correction fluid. And the square, at least, still looked the way it was supposed to look this time of year. Main Street was already stirring by the time she parked, the bakery's door propped open despite the cold to let out the smell of the first batch of the day. A delivery truck idling outside the hardware store while 2 men wrestled a pallet of rock salt onto the sidewalk. A group of school kids clustered near the corner, waiting for a bus that was running late, stamping their feet against the cold in a rhythm that had nothing to do with impatience and everything to do with staying warm. The morning had turned colder overnight, the kind of cold that made the snow squeak instead of crunch underfoot. And a work crew from the town's maintenance department had a section of the tree's lower branches pulled back, exposing a tangle of wiring that ran down into a junction box half buried at the base of the trunk. A man in a town-issued jacket knelt beside it, testing sections of cord with a small meter, muttering to himself every few seconds in the tone of someone talking mostly to keep his hands company. "Morning," Nora said, coming to a stop a few feet away. "Everything all right?" Define all right. The man did not look up right away, working the meter along another few inches of cord before he did. "We had 3 strands go dark on the north side last night. Found the first short about 20 minutes ago." He held up a short length of wire. The plastic coating along one section blistered and curled back on itself. The copper beneath it visibly darkened. "This is not cold weather doing that. Cold makes things brittle. It does not make them melt." Nora crouched down beside him, close enough to catch the faint, acrid smell still clinging to the wire. Sharper than wood smoke, more chemical. The kind of smell that lingered on skin and fabric long after the source had cooled. "You get this a lot?" "More than I would like to admit publicly." He set the wire down on a folded tarp beside a handful of similar fragments already collected. "Every year we get a few bad runs. Usually it is old stock, something left over from a decade ago finally giving out. This looks newer than that." "Newer how?" "The insulation. Older stuff degrades slow, cracks before it melts. This one looks like the wire inside was carrying more heat than the coating could handle from the start, like it was never rated for what we are asking it to do." He shrugged, the gesture of a man paid to fix things rather than explain them. "I just replace it. Somebody else worries about why." He straightened up, pressing a hand to the small of his back with a wince that suggested a long career spent kneeling on cold pavement and worse. "Been doing this 15 years. Used to be maybe 1 bad string a season, if that. Last couple years, it feels like every other week something is off somewhere on this square. Nobody wants to spend the money to do it properly, I would guess. And then everybody acts surprised when it shows." "Where does it come from, the lights?" "Town contracts it all through Rose Lighting. Has for years. Same supplier every season, I think, though I could not tell you the paperwork side of it. You would want the purchase records for that, and those live at the town office, not out here with me and a multimeter." He set the tool down and rubbed his hands together against the cold. Whole run along this side of the square is the same batch, best I can tell. If one section's bad, more of it probably is too. Nora looked up at the tree, its height disappearing into a canopy of lights strung in tight, even spirals, warm and steady from where she stood, giving no outward sign of the melted fragment sitting on the tarp a few feet away. A generator idling behind the maintenance truck hummed low and constant under the crew's conversation, the only sound on the square this early. Most of Main Street still quiet, with the particular stillness of a cold morning before the shops opened. "Mind if I take a section of that for the file?" she asked. "Take the whole tarp for all I care. I've got 6 more strands to test before lunch." He waved a hand toward it without much ceremony, already turning back to the junction box. Nora bagged 2 of the more visibly damaged fragments and made a note of the maintenance report number stenciled on the side of the truck, then walked the short distance to the town office to see about the purchase records the technician had mentioned. The clerk at the front counter, a woman Nora vaguely recognized from the church coat drive, pulled up what she could on the computer. A general contract summary listing Rose Lighting as the town's exclusive vendor for holiday displays going back 8 years. But the itemized purchase orders themselves lived in a filing cabinet at Thomas's own office, rather than the town's system. An arrangement apparently left over from before anyone digitized much of anything. "I can request them formally," the clerk said, already reaching for a form. He usually gets those over within a few days, sometimes longer this time of year, since he's out on the square more than at his desk. A few days works. The clerk filled in the request slowly, checking a binder beside her computer for the correct department code, the kind of paperwork that clearly had not changed its format since long before she started the job. Behind her, a small radio on the shelf played carols at a volume just low enough to be background noise, interrupted every few minutes by a burst of static nobody bothered to adjust. A framed photo of the previous year's tree lighting hung crooked on the wall above the filing cabinets, Clara visible near the edge of the crowd in it, caught mid-laugh. A detail the clerk had clearly stopped noticing a long time ago. "Sad business, all this," the clerk said, sliding the form into an outgoing tray. She used to come in here every November to file the same permit for the toy drive collection boxes. Never once needed reminding of the deadline. I am going to miss that, honestly. More than I expected to. Nora nodded, thanked her again, and stepped back outside into the flat gray light of mid-morning before the conversation could drift any further into the kind of small grief that was easy to fall into and harder to climb back out of on a workday. The cold settled into her jacket faster now that she had stopped moving. She crossed back toward the square to collect the rest of the fragments the technician had bagged, and it was there, near the far edge of the tree line, that she noticed Thomas standing some distance off, arms crossed, watching the crew work without approaching them. He was too far away for conversation and made no move to close the distance, though his attention seemed fixed less on the crew replacing the wiring and more on the tree itself, or perhaps on the space just beside it. It was hard to tell from that far off. When one of the crew members called out a question toward him, something about whether the remaining fixtures on the east side needed checking too, Thomas answered without moving closer, his voice carrying just far enough for Nora to catch the tone, if not the words. Brisk, businesslike. Nothing in it that read as anything other than a contractor managing an inconvenience. He stayed like that for a while, longer than seemed necessary for a man simply checking on his own crew's work, his eyes moving from the wiring at the base of the trunk up toward the branches and back down again, as though tracing the same path the technician's meter had followed a half-hour earlier. Then he checked his watch, said something short to the nearest crew member, and left a few minutes later, walking off toward the lot where his truck was parked without acknowledging Nora at all, though she was fairly sure he had seen her. She stood by the tarp a moment longer, turning one of the melted fragments over in its evidence bag, the plastic still faintly discolored under the overhead light strung above the crew's workspace. It told her very little on its own. A piece of wire that had failed under conditions it should not have failed under, traced back to a supplier who had held this contract for 8 years without complaint that she had ever heard of. The fragment was too slight to build a case on, yet she also knew, the way she had learned to know things slowly rather than all at once, that a fact sitting quietly on its own rarely stayed alone for long once you started asking who else had touched it. She packed the remaining fragments into her bag, thanked the technician again on her way past, and walked back toward her car with the cold settling fully into her hands now that she had stopped moving long enough for it to catch up with her. The school kids from earlier had finally boarded their bus, and Main Street had filled in around her without her quite noticing when it happened. A few more shoppers drifting between storefronts, someone's radio drifting out through a prop door, playing the same carol the town office clerk had left running behind her. The generator's hum faded behind her with every step, the tree's lights holding steady overhead, giving away nothing at all. Chapter 7. The Lit Square. Nora did not go straight home after her shift ended. She parked near the harbor instead and walked the rest of the way into the square on foot, telling herself it was for the exercise, though she suspected the truth had more to do with not wanting to be alone inside 4 walls just yet. The square had filled in for the evening the way it did every night this close to the lighting, though the actual event was still more than a week off. A hot cocoa stand had set up near the gazebo, run by 2 teenagers Nora recognized from the high school, one of them wearing reindeer antlers slightly askew, the other counting out change with the exaggerated concentration of someone who had only started the job that week. A cluster of younger kids chased each other around the base of the tree, breath coming out in quick white puffs. Their parents standing a few feet back in a loose circle, holding paper cups and talking over each other about school schedules and travel plans for the holiday. One father called out for his daughter to stop climbing the low stone wall around the gazebo, a request she ignored twice before finally sliding down on her own, unhurried, satisfied with however long the small rebellion had lasted. Somewhere near the church, a small group had gathered to rehearse carols for the lighting ceremony, their voices carrying thin and a little uneven across the cold air, stopping every so often to argue good-naturedly about which verse came next. Nora walked past them without stopping, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets, breath fogging in front of her with every exhale. One of the teenagers at the cocoa stand called out to her as she passed, holding up a paper cup. "On the house, officer. Boss's orders." Sort of. "My mom said cops should always get the first cup." The girl grinned, antlers slipping further sideways with the motion. "Tell your mom I said thank you." Nora took the cup, more out of politeness than thirst, and stood there a moment longer while the girl's friend finished counting a stack of quarters into the register with theatrical seriousness. The cocoa was too sweet and slightly burnt at the bottom, the way it always was from that stand every year, and Nora drank it anyway, standing off to the side while the 2 of them argued about whether to close early or wait out the last stragglers drifting through on their way home from work. The tree stood at the center of it all, exactly as it always did this time of year, lights running the full height of it in long, even spirals, throwing warm color across the snow banked up around its base. Nora stopped a few feet from where the technician had been working that morning, the ground beneath the branches still slightly disturbed where the crew had knelt and crouched and left their boot prints in overlapping patterns. She looked up at it for a long moment. It was, she thought, exactly as beautiful as it had been every year of her life, the same warm glow spilling out over the same patch of snow, drawing the same small crowds with paper cups and the same restless children weaving between their parents' legs. Nothing about it looked any different than it should. That, somehow, made it worse. She found the low stone bench near the gazebo, mostly cleared of snow by foot traffic, and sat for a while, with the empty cocoa cup turning slowly between her hands. A woman walked past with a dog on a leash, exchanging a quick nod with her, not stopping to talk. And further off, one of the rehearsing carolers finally hit the harmony they had been chasing all evening, drawing a small, ragged cheer from the rest of the group before they moved on to the next verse. Nora let the sound wash past her without really listening to the words, watching instead the way the tree's lights caught in the fresh snow underneath it, scattering small points of red and gold across the white, in a pattern that shifted every time the wind stirred the branches. She thought about the melted wire sitting bagged in her car. She thought about Thomas, standing at the edge of the tree line that morning, watching something she still could not name. She thought, longer than she meant to, about the 6-year-old dragging his mother toward the cocoa stand an hour earlier, certain of exactly what he wanted and unbothered by anything else in the world. Eventually, she stood, dropped the empty cup into a trash bin near the gazebo, and pulled out her phone. Calling Ed without quite deciding to, he picked up on the second ring. The sound of the television low in the background, muted almost immediately once he realized it was her. "You are still out," he said, not a question. "I am at the square." She turned slowly on the spot, taking in the whole scope of it. The cocoa stand, the carolers, the tree lit up against a sky gone fully dark. "It looks exactly the same as always. That is what I cannot get past." "It usually does. Towns are stubborn that way." She heard the faint creak of his armchair shifting, Biscuit's collar tag clinking once as he resettled somewhere near Ed's feet. "You did not call to tell me about the lights." "No." "All right then." A pause. Then his voice again, quieter. "Things that hurt people rarely bother announcing it first." Nora watched a boy of maybe 6 drag his mother by the hand toward the cocoa stand, insistent, certain of his priorities. "He was selling poison," she said, "and she was going to stop him." Ed did not answer right away. She could picture him exactly as he would be sitting, the phone against his ear, Biscuit probably curled somewhere near his feet, the television still glowing silently across the room. "So he killed her," Nora said, when the silence had gone on long enough that she needed to fill it herself. "That is what poisoners do," Ed said. He did not add anything to it. He did not ask her what she meant by poison, did not press for names or specifics, did not offer the kind of reassurance that would have made the moment easier and less true. He let the sentence sit there between them, plain and unadorned, the way he let most things sit when he judged that adding more to them would only take something away. In the background, Biscuit let out a single low sigh, the particular sound he made when he had decided to fall asleep exactly where he was, rather than move somewhere more comfortable. Nora closed her eyes for a second, the cold air sharp against her face, the distant sound of the carolers finally finding their harmony behind her. "Go home," Ed said eventually, his voice gentler now. "It will still be there tomorrow." "I know." "I am aware you know. I am saying it anyway." She almost smiled at that, despite everything. "Good night, Ed." "Good night." She held the phone a moment longer after the call ended, the screen dimming in her palm, then slid it back into her pocket and stood there a while longer without any particular purpose, just watching. The 2 teenagers at the cocoa stand were closing up for the night, stacking empty cup sleeves into a cardboard box, the reindeer antlers finally coming off with visible relief. The carolers had drifted apart into smaller groups, still talking, still laughing about something Nora was too far away to hear. The children by the tree had been called home one by one, until only a single stray mitten remained in the snow near the base of the trunk, dropped and forgotten, bright red against the white. Nora walked over and picked it up, turning it over once, before setting it on the low stone wall that ran along the edge of the square, in case whoever had lost it came looking before the next snowfall buried it. She did not go back to her car right away. She walked the perimeter of the square once more, slow, leisurely, past the gazebo and the closed cocoa stand, and the church steps where the last of the carolers were saying their goodnights, buttoning coats, and calling out plans to meet again the same time next week. One of them, an older man Nora recognized as the choir director from the Methodist church, lifted a hand to her in greeting without breaking off his conversation, and she returned the gesture without stopping either, content to let the evening keep moving around her rather than through her. The stationery shop on the corner had already gone dark for the night, its window display of hand-painted ornaments lit only by the ambient glow spilling over from the square itself. Somewhere behind the hardware store, a dog barked twice at nothing in particular, then went quiet again. A car eased past in the far side of the square, tires soft against the packed snow, headlights sweeping briefly across the closed shop fronts before turning down toward the harbor road. The tree's lights held steady behind her the whole way, throwing long, soft shadows across the snow that stretched and shortened again every time she passed beneath a different string of bulbs. Nora walked slower than she needed to, in no particular hurry to reach the car, in no particular hurry to be anywhere else at all. By the time she reached her car, the cold had settled fully into her hands, and the square behind her had gone quiet enough that she could hear the faint electrical hum of the lights themselves, the low, steady sound of something working exactly as it was built to, giving no sign at all of anything underneath it. She sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting the engine, looking back once at the tree through the windshield, warm and constant against the dark, before finally turning the key and pulling away toward home. Chapter 8 watched from across the street. The station had settled into its usual midday rhythm by the time the records arrived. A dispatcher, 2 desks over, fielding a call about an abandoned shopping cart someone had left blocking the pharmacy's handicap spot. Another officer arguing amiably with a vending machine that had eaten his dollar for the second time that week. Somebody had strung a single, half-hearted line of tinsel along the top of the bulletin board weeks ago, and it had drooped further with each passing day until it now hung at a permanent, defeated angle nobody had bothered to fix. The records arrived at the station a little after 2 in the afternoon, delivered by courier rather than mail. A thick manila envelope with Rose Lighting stamped in the corner, and the town clerk's request form stapled to the front. Cole set it on Nora's desk without comment, already half turned back toward his own office, and left her to open it alone. The purchase orders inside went back 3 years, itemized by batch number, supplier, and unit cost. The kind of paperwork that looked dull until you started reading it the way Nora had learned to read things, slowly, watching for the place where the numbers stopped matching the story they were supposed to tell. The certified domestic supplier listed on the town's insurance paperwork did not appear anywhere in the actual purchase history. Instead, every order for the last several seasons traced back to an overseas distributor Nora had never heard of. The unit costs a fraction of what certified stock should have run. The invoices themselves, stamped with a product code that did not match anything in the safety certification binder the clerk had also included. Thomas had been buying cheap, uncertified wire for years and reselling it to the town under a different name entirely, pocketing the difference every season, while the certification paperwork stayed clean on paper and rotten underneath it, the same way the wire itself had looked fine from the outside, until it started to melt. Nora laid the invoices side by side across her desk, matching batch numbers to the maintenance reports Cole had pulled from the last 3 winters. Small electrical failures logged and closed out without much follow-up, the kind of thing that got filed away and forgotten once the lights came back on. 6 incidents in 3 years, all from the same batch numbers she was looking at now. She was still working through the 3rd year of records when Cole appeared in her doorway, his coat already half on. "Bakery across from the shop finally called back about their camera," he said. "Owner says she has been meaning to mention it since the day we found Clara, kept forgetting between customers. Footage covers the sidewalk out front, both directions, the night in question included." They walked over together. The cold sharper now than it had been that morning, the sky already starting its early slide toward dusk, though it was barely 3:30. A few last customers lingered near the bakery's front counter, debating between the remaining loaves in the case, and a bell rang somewhere behind them as someone else pushed through the door for a late afternoon coffee. The bakery smelled the way it always smelled this time of day, butter and yeast thick in the warm air. Trays of afternoon bread cooling on racks, visible through the pass-through to the kitchen. The owner led them past the counter and through a narrow hallway stacked with flour sacks and empty delivery crates into the back office, a cramped space barely large enough for the desk and the small bank of monitors mounted above it, screens glowing pale blue in a room with no windows. A space heater hummed under the desk, doing little against the draft from the loading door down the hall, and a calendar from a restaurant supply company hung crooked on the wall, still turned to November. "I do not usually even look at this thing," she said, pulling up a chair for Nora while Cole leaned against the doorframe. "My nephew installed it after somebody swiped the tip jar 2 summers ago. I forget it exists most weeks." She queued up the footage from the night of the murder, timestamp scrolling in the corner, the sidewalk outside rendered in grainy black and white, lit mostly by the string of lights running along the awning above the bakery's own window. Nora watched the empty street for a long stretch, nothing moving except the occasional gust lifting a stray flake of snow across the frame, until a figure crossed into view from the left edge of the screen. The timestamp read 8:15. The man walked with the unhurried confidence of someone approaching a familiar door, paused at the entrance to the Mistletoe Shop, and let himself in without knocking. Nora leaned closer to the screen. The resolution was poor, the figure mostly a dark shape against the lit shop window, but the build and the walk matched what she had seen outside the shop only days earlier. A man in a work jacket, deliberate, methodical. Thomas Rowe. They watched the empty sidewalk for the next half hour, nothing changing except the slow drift of snow past the streetlight at the corner, until the same figure emerged again at 8:45, pulling the door shut behind him, pausing only a moment before walking back the way he had come, out of frame, gone. "That is our window," Cole said quietly. "Matches the ME's estimate almost exactly." Nora nodded, but her attention had already caught on something else in the frame, a shape she had missed the first time through. Tucked into the recessed doorway of the shuttered antique store 2 buildings down on the opposite side of the street, a second figure stood there, motionless, angled just enough that the awning above him kept most of his face in shadow, present through nearly the entire 30-minute window, never approaching, never leaving, simply watching. "Who is that?" Nora said, more to herself than to either of them. The bakery owner leaned in for a better look. "I have no idea. Could be anybody waiting on a ride, I suppose, though nobody waits that long for anything in this cold." Cole rewound the footage and let it play again, slower this time, but the figure gave up nothing more on a second viewing. The doorway shadow too complete, the distance too great for the camera's resolution to resolve any detail beyond a general shape. A coat, a stillness that did not match anyone simply passing through. "Get me a still, if you can pull one," Cole said to the bakery owner, "and copies of the full file, both angles if you have them." She nodded, already reaching for a blank flash drive from a drawer beneath the monitors. Cole stepped out to take a call, leaving Nora alone with the paused frame a moment longer, the shape in the doorway frozen mid-watch, giving away nothing. She thought about the invoices back at her desk, the batch numbers lined up in careful rows, the 6 incidents over 3 years that all traced back to the same source. She thought about Thomas letting himself into the shop at 8:15 and walking out again at 8:45, exactly inside the window the medical examiner had given them. And she thought about the second figure in the doorway, patient, unmoving, present for the entire half hour, and then simply gone from the frame once Thomas had gone too, without ever once approaching the door himself. 2 threads, pulling in 2 directions. One traced through paperwork and batch numbers to a man with every reason to want Clara silenced. The other traced through nothing yet but a shape in a doorway, who had stood watching a murder happen and done nothing about it, for reasons that were, for the moment, entirely his own. Nora gathered the flash drive once the bakery owner finished burning the files, thanked her, and stepped back out onto the sidewalk where Cole was just finishing his call. The cold had sharpened further while they had been inside, the last gray light draining fast out of the sky, and across the street, the Mistletoe Shop sat dark and locked, its window display finally switched off for the night. The first time Nora could remember seeing it that way since she was a child. She did not say anything yet about which thread she believed. It was too soon for that, and she had learned, mostly from watching Cole work cases far longer than she had been alive, that the thread that looked strongest on the first pass through the evidence was not always the one that held once you pulled on it properly. Cole fell into step beside her as they walked back toward the station, the flash drive tucked into his coat pocket. The still photograph the bakery owner had managed to pull, already printed and folded, inside a manila folder under his arm. Neither of them spoke for the first block, the cold enough of an occupation on its own, boots crunching in rhythm over the packed snow along Main Street. "We will run the photo past the county database," Cole said eventually. "See if anything comes back. In the meantime, I want that batch number cross-referenced against every incident report we have, going back as far as the clerk's office keeps records." "I can start on that tonight." "Start on it tomorrow. You've been running since Tuesday." He said it without much room for argument, the tone he used when he had already decided something and expected her to accept it rather than debate it. "Go home. Eat something that is not gas station coffee." She let it go, mostly because she did not have the energy to push back, and they parted ways at the corner, Cole heading back toward the station with the folder under his arm, Nora continuing on toward her car, parked further down the block. Chapter 9. Who Reads the Label? Cole caught her at her desk before she had even taken her coat off, a printout in his hand, the county database logo stamped across the top corner. The station had mostly cleared out for the evening, a few desks still occupied by officers finishing paperwork before shift change. Someone's forgotten mug of coffee gone cold on the counter beside the radio. "Rental car," he said, setting it in front of her. "Plate matches a vehicle out of a Portland agency. Picked up 4 days before the murder, returned 2 days after. Renter's name is David Ashford." Nora looked at the printout, then up at Cole. Her ex-husband. Boston address on file, but the agency confirms he extended the rental twice while he was here. Motel on the outskirts of town has him checked in the same window. Cole crossed his arms, leaning against the edge of her desk. "I sent a unit to bring him in for questioning an hour ago." "He watched it happen," Nora said, mostly to herself, working through what that meant. "He stood in that doorway for half an hour and did not move. We will ask him why. But look at the footage again before you go assuming anything. He never approaches the shop, never touches the door. If he wanted to hurt her, he had 30 uninterrupted minutes and an empty street to do it in, and he did not." Cole tapped the printout once more before straightening up. My guess, for what it is worth, is a man who drove 3 hours hoping to say something to his ex-wife and lost his nerve every single time he got close enough to try. She sat with that a moment, turning the printout over once, and slid it into the growing stack of paper that had accumulated on her desk over the last several days. Somewhere in that stack, she suspected, sat everything she actually needed. It was only a matter of arranging it in the right order. She stayed after Cole left for the evening, the station emptying out around her one desk at a time until only the dispatcher remained, radio murmuring low from the front counter. Nora laid the evidence out across her desk, the way she had learned to from watching Cole do it, not in the order it had arrived, but in the order it had happened. The paperweight, missing from its place on the shelf, picked up on the way toward Clara rather than on the way to a display. The purchase orders, 3 years of certified safety paperwork covering for uncertified stock bought cheap and sold at a markup. 6 incidents over 3 years, all traced to the same batch numbers, all closed out quietly before anyone thought to ask why they kept happening. The bakery footage, time-stamped 8:15 to 8:45. A man letting himself into a locked shop as if he had done it 100 times before and had every reason to expect he would be let in. And underneath all of it, a small thing she had almost let slip past her entirely. Clara, 11 days before her death, holding up a sprig of mistletoe near the window light. Beautiful things are often dangerous. Nobody reads the label until it matters. Nora had filed it away as nothing more than a shopkeeper's habit of turning ordinary conversation into a small performance. She understood it differently now. Sitting at her desk with 3 years of falsified invoices spread out in front of her, Clara had not been talking about mistletoe at all. Not really. She had already known, or at least suspected, exactly what she was dealing with, and had said so out loud to a woman who was not yet in a position to understand what she meant. She thought too about David Ashford, sitting somewhere down the hall in an interview room by now, giving whatever version of the truth he had finally decided to give. A man who had spent a year unable to let go of a marriage that had already ended, standing in a doorway across from the shop, watching, wanting to speak to her, never quite finding the nerve, and then watching something happen that he would carry for the rest of his life, regardless of what came of the charges against him, if any did. Nora had expected a different story when she first saw that shape frozen in the corner of the frame. Yet this one, she thought, rang truer than most of the tales she had been told this week, precisely because nobody involved had bothered to polish it into something more palatable. Nora closed her eyes for a moment, then gathered the file, the invoices, the printed still from the bakery camera, and called Cole. They drove out to Rose Lighting together. The road's quiet this late, street lights giving way to the darker stretch beyond the edge of town, where houses thinned out and the plowed shoulders narrowed to little more than a single lane in each direction. Cole did not say much on the drive, both of them watching the headlights carve a tunnel through the dark, snowbanks rising pale on either side. A low corrugated building came into view at the end of a gravel drive, serving as both office and storage. A chain-link fence around a yard stacked with spools of cable and pallets of replacement fixtures waiting for next season. A single fluorescent tube buzzed unevenly above the loading bay door, casting a thin, uneven light across the gravel. Thomas's truck sat parked near the entrance, engine block still ticking faintly as it cooled. He was inside when they arrived, coiling a length of cord onto a spool, and he did not stop working when the door opened, though something in the set of his shoulders shifted the moment he saw who it was. Officers. He set the cord down slowly. Bit late for a site visit. "We have some questions about your supply records," Cole said, stepping further into the storage bay, Nora a half step behind him. The air inside smelled of solder and cold metal, dust thick along the shelving where spare fixtures sat boxed and stacked to the ceiling. "I already sent everything over. Nothing to hide there." "We noticed that too." Nora set the folder down on a workbench between them, opening it to the first page of purchase orders. "Except the supplier does not match your safety certification. 6 incidents in 3 years, same batch numbers every time." Thomas looked at the folder without picking it up. "Cheap stock, sure. Everybody cuts corners somewhere. That is not a crime." "It might be, depending on what else it touches." Cole nodded toward Nora, who set the printed still from the bakery footage down beside the invoices. 8:15 to 8:45. You went in the front, and we have you on camera leaving the same way at 8:45. That is a long conversation for a man just discussing lights. Thomas's expression hardened, a familiar tightening at the jaw that Nora now recognized as the tell of someone bracing for a blow. "And the paperweight?" Nora asked, pulling the inventory sheet from her folder. "Clara sold 6 of them in a set, at the scene. 1 was missing, the one found beside her body. The dust on the shelf showed it was taken straight up, not knocked over. You did not bring it with you, so you must have picked it up inside the shop." Thomas did not answer for a long moment. Then, "It was on the shelf near the door. I saw it when I walked in. I did not plan it. It was just there. She called me in," he said finally, his voice flat. "Found a melted wire while she was helping with the tree. Traced it back to my supplier. Wanted to talk it through before she went to the town council." "And you convinced her not to?" "I tried." His voice had gone flat, stripped of the easy charm Nora remembered from their conversation outside the shop. Told her it was a one-time supplier mix-up. Told her I would fix it, replace every strand on the square myself, if she just gave me until after the holidays. She would not hear it. Said the town's safety mattered more than my business staying open. "So you picked up the paperweight?" Thomas did not answer that directly. He looked past both of them, toward the loading bay door, toward the gravel yard beyond it, the fluorescent tube overhead buzzing steadily through the silence that followed. "She had her phone in her hand," he said eventually, "already dialing. 8 years. I built that contract. 8 years. And she was going to end it over a spool of wire nobody would have noticed if she had just let it go. I saw it drop when she fell. I did not know what to do with it, so I picked it up, turned it off, and put it in my pocket. I threw it in the bay later that night." Nora and Cole exchanged a glance. They had not found the phone. Now they knew why. Cole stepped forward. "Thomas Rowe, you are under arrest for the murder of Clara Ashford." He did not resist. He set down the length of cord he had picked back up without realizing it, wiped his hands on his jacket, the way Nora had seen him do a dozen times outside the shop, adjusting a ladder, checking a wire, and let Cole guide him out toward the waiting cruiser without another word. Nora stayed behind a moment longer in the storage bay, the fluorescent tube still buzzing overhead, spools of cable stacked in careful rows along every wall, ordinary and unremarkable. The same kind of wire strung around every lamppost and doorway in Harrow Cove this time of year. There was no relief in it, standing there, only the particular heaviness that settled in after something finally stopped being a question and started being a fact. A weight that did not lift just because the case had closed. She walked the length of the storage bay once, past the shelving stacked with boxed fixtures destined for a season Thomas would not see finished, past a clipboard hanging by the door, still listing tomorrow's scheduled repairs in his own handwriting, half of them now somebody else's problem to sort out. She gathered the folder from the workbench, switched off the light nearest the door out of habit rather than necessity, and walked out into the cold to join Cole at the car, the gravel crunching underfoot. the fence line rattling faintly in the wind behind her. Chapter 10. What the Season Leaves Behind. The town relit the tree 8 days after Thomas Rowe's arrest, the maintenance crew having spent the better part of a week stripping out every strand he had ever supplied and replacing it with certified stock paid for, according to the notice posted outside the town office, out of an emergency fund nobody had known existed until it was suddenly needed. The lighting had been quietly rescheduled twice already that season. This time, nobody seemed inclined to delay it further. Nora arrived without her uniform, coat buttoned against a cold that had settled in for good now, the kind that meant business rather than the earlier week's half-hearted chill. Ed walked beside her, Biscuit's leash looped twice around his gloved hand, the dog straining occasionally toward the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from a cart near the church steps. The square had filled in more than Nora had seen it fill in years. Most of Main Street turned out for the occasion, stroller wheels crunching over packed snow, a cluster of teenagers taking photos of each other in front of the darkened tree before the countdown started. Someone had set up a small stage near the gazebo, decorated with the same string lights the town had used every year, unrelated to anything Rose Lighting had ever supplied. And the mayor stood near the microphone, rehearsing a short speech under her breath, while an aide fussed with the sound system. The cocoa stand had returned for the occasion too, the same 2 teenagers running it, one of them still fighting with the same crooked pair of reindeer antlers, though this time a line had formed nearly to the gazebo steps, families and older couples alike waiting their turn in the cold. Further along, a table had been set up, selling raffle tickets for the church's winter fundraiser, and beside it, somewhat incongruously, a folding table stacked high with donated toys. A hand-lettered sign taped to the front reading, "Toy Drive Still Happening. Clara would want it this way." The handwriting unmistakably Sarah's. "She looks nervous," Ed said, nodding toward the mayor. "She has been nervous since Tuesday. Cole says she rewrote the speech 4 times. "What changed each time?" "How much she mentions Clara by name. I think too little feels careless. Too much feels like she is using the funeral for a photo opportunity." Ed made a small sound of agreement and did not offer an opinion either way, watching instead as a family a few feet ahead debated whether their youngest was old enough to hold his own cup of cocoa without spilling it on his coat. Word had moved through town the way it always moved, faster than any official statement, filling in details nobody had confirmed and correcting itself as more became known. Eleanor Ashford, Nora had heard, left Harrow Cove 3 days after Thomas's arrest, quietly, without ceremony, though not before arranging the funeral herself, down to the last detail. Down to the specific arrangement of white roses Clara had once mentioned offhand to a florist years earlier, and apparently never forgotten telling anyone. She left no forwarding address at the inn, only a note at the front desk thanking the staff for their patience, which the desk clerk had mentioned to at least 4 different people since, each retelling a little more embellished than the last. Sarah Cross had finished paying back what she owed within the week, faster than anyone expected, using savings she admitted to Cole she had been keeping for an emergency that, in the end, turned out to be exactly this one. She had taken a job at the bakery across from the shuttered Mistletoe Shop, restocking the front case most mornings, the owner apparently deciding that a woman capable of confessing to 5 years of small dishonesty unprompted was more trustworthy than most people who had never been caught doing anything at all. David Ashford had been released without charges 2 days after his initial questioning, the county attorney finding nothing in the statute that covered standing in a doorway and doing nothing, however troubling the nothing had turned out to be in hindsight. He drove back to Boston the following morning. According to the motel owner, who had watched him load a single duffel bag into his car and pull out of the lot without stopping anywhere else in town first, Cole mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that David had left a small, unsigned card at the front desk, addressed to no one in particular. Meant, the clerk guessed, for whatever memorial the town eventually arranged. None of it needed retelling in full. Standing here in the cold, with a cup of cider warming her hands, it existed now mostly as the kind of thing people would still be discussing quietly at the diner counter well into the new year, softened at the edges each time somebody passed it along, until eventually it settled into the same category as every other story the town told about itself. Half memory and half legend, true enough in its shape, even where the details blurred. The mayor stepped up to the microphone as the last of the daylight finally gave out, thanking the crowd for their patience, thanking the maintenance crew by name for their work this week, and then, briefly, thanking Clara Ashford for 10 years of making this particular week feel the way it was supposed to feel for the whole town, rather than just for the people who could afford to make it feel that way on their own. She did not linger on it. The crowd went quiet all the same. A held breath that lasted exactly as long as it needed to before the mayor moved on to the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The tree came alive all at once, the whole height of it catching light in the same tight, even spirals it had worn every December of Nora's life. And the crowd made the sound crowds always made at moments like this. A mix of applause and a few scattered cheers from somewhere near the back, where a group of kids had clearly been waiting all evening for exactly this. Ed handed Nora a fresh cup of hot cider from the stand near the gazebo, steam curling up thick between them in the cold air, and they stood together at the edge of the crowd the way they always stood at things like this, close enough to feel part of it, far enough back to watch the whole scene rather than only their small piece of it. Somewhere behind the crowd, the church bells began their evening ring, faint and steady, carrying across the square in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the lighting and everything to do with an hour that simply happened to arrive at the same time. Biscuit sat at Ed's feet, mostly unbothered by the noise, occasionally lifting his head toward the smell of cider before deciding it was not worth the effort of standing. "Good turnout," Ed said. "Best in years, probably. People need somewhere to put it. A crowd like this, lights like this, easier than sitting at home with it." Near the toy drive table, Nora watched Sarah hand a stuffed rabbit to a woman with 2 young children, laughing at something one of them said, the exchange easy and unhurried, in a way that suggested whatever weight Sarah had been carrying through the back office days earlier had, if not lifted entirely, at least loosened its grip enough to let a little of the old warmth back through. Cole stood a short distance off near the mayor's stage, out of uniform for once, nodding along to something the fire chief was telling him, both of them holding cups of cider identical to the ones Nora and Ed carried. Nora nodded, watching the light scatter across the fresh snow the way it always did, the same warm color she remembered from every year of her life. Except this year, she understood a little more of what could hide behind something that looked exactly as it should. Her phone buzzed once against her hip. She pulled it free with her free hand, the other still wrapped around the warm cup. Almost there. Made it past Bangor. She read it twice, the same way she had read the one from the week before, and typed back only 2 words before slipping the phone away again. "I know." Ed did not ask who it was. He rarely did anymore. He only reached down to scratch behind Biscuit's ears, watching the tree glow steady against the dark. The crowd beginning to thin now that the countdown had passed, the bells still ringing somewhere behind them, slow and even, counting out an hour that had nothing left to do with the case at all. The crowd thinned gradually around them as the cider cooled in their hands, families peeling off one by one toward their cars, the teenagers finally closing down the cocoa stand for the second time that week. The mayor's aide began coiling the sound cables while a few stragglers lingered near the tree, taking one last photo before the cold finally drove them home too. Ed and Nora walked back the long way, past the harbor where the tide had gone fully out again, the mud flats pale and empty under a sky just beginning to clear, past the church where the bells had finally gone quiet, past the darkened window of the Mistletoe Shop itself, still empty, a small handwritten sign taped inside the glass, thanking the community for its patience while the family decided what would come next for the space. Biscuit trotted ahead of them, unbothered by any of it, more interested in the fresh snow along the curb than anything happening behind any of the windows they passed. They walked home together, through streets still lit from end to end, snow falling soft and steady under every lamppost they passed.